This is NEGOTIATEx Podcast, show number 102.
Hello, and welcome to the NEGOTIATEx Podcast. I'm Nolan Martin, and with me, as always, Aaron Denizian. Aaron, want to kick it off today?
I will. Thanks, Nolan. As many of our listeners know, or perhaps don't know, we often record our podcast episodes several months in advance. That means the world often changes between when we record something and when it airs. Now, we intentionally invited this episode's guest knowing that we'd release right around the election. And our hope is that regardless of your view on the outcome of the election, today's message gives you both hope and purpose. Diana McLain Smith is a renowned thought leader who has led change efforts for 35 years in some of America's most iconic businesses and cutting-edge nonprofits. A former partner at the Monitor Group and a former chief executive partner at New Profit, Smith developed an approach to conflict and change called leading through relationships. Smith's frameworks and tools captured in The Elephant in the Room, Divide or Conquer, and dozens of articles have been used around the world to turn intergroup conflict into a powerful force for change. She shares her life with negotiation expert Bruce Patton, co-author of Getting to Yes and Difficult Conversations in Vermont and Massachusetts with their two rambunctious dogs, Atticus and Scout. Now, back in 2010, we had the pleasure of hosting Bruce as our keynote speaker for the first West Point Negotiation Project Conference. So today is a little bit of coming full circle. Diana's most recent book is Remaking the Space Between Us, How Citizens Can Work Together to Build a Better Future for All. Diana, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here, and it's wonderful to talk to somebody who's been immersed in the negotiation world, a world near and dear to my heart.
Good. There was a question I wanted to put in here, which is, I assume based on reading your book, knowing Bruce, you two never have any conflict.
I like to say if we can make our marriage work, we can make America work. When we first got married, we had this really old it's called a sub-zero refrigerator, but I kept slipping up and calling it a zero-sum refrigerator because it kept melting my ice cream because the freezer didn't work. And we'd have these really productive fights. We're getting a new refrigerator. No, we're not. Yes, we are. No, we're not. Well, eventually, we did come up with a creative solution, which was to buy a very inexpensive freezer and put it in the closet. That saved our marriage, and we're celebrating 30 years this fall.
Oh, congratulations. That's wonderful. And listen, when it comes to melting ice cream, my wife would call that a national tragedy.
It was a national tragedy, believe me.
Diana, thank you for being here. We're going to dig into your book in just a second. And before we do, I'd love to hear about your journey, what has led you to this point in your life, the work that you do, and especially the drive behind writing this book.
You know, it's always a little bit hard to condense longer and longer career into a short story. But the metaphor I always use is I'm the Goldilocks of systems change. So when I began working to try to change systems, I began in the late 60s, early 70s. I was a youngster at the time. I worked with the political candidates that were running for office. I was community organizing. I would take on different issues and work to try to change how the political system operated. And after about 6 years of that, I said, my God, these systems are just too big. I can't affect change the way I'd like to. And one of the people I met while community organizing was part of a community mental health center that worked with kids, low-income kids. And he said, you'd be great working with kids. Why don't you come on over? We'll train you how to counsel these kids, how to help them navigate the community that they live in, the schools, the courts, everything. And I said, sure. And so I got trained by some of the best people in the field, David Cantor, the founder of Family Therapy, and some psychologists who were terrific. And so I did that for about 6 years. I got somewhat burned out because it's intense work. And at the end of it, I said, these systems are just a little too small. One person at a time, where are you going to get? So I went off to graduate school and really by happenstance came across a fellow by the name of Chris Argyris, who was one of the founders of the field of organizational learning. And I discovered that there were a whole bunch of people trying to create a new kind of organization, one that was able to adapt and learn and was flexible and responsive, not just to the environment outside, but inside. And so I got very excited by that, and I ended up working in organizations for about 30 years. And then, we'll talk more about this later, but then a few years ago, as things began to go to hell in a handbasket in our nation, I began to see parallels between the intergroup conflict that I saw and worked on in organizations and the intergroup conflict I was seeing in our nation. And so I began to shift full bore back 360 degrees to working in political systems.
How did you personally grow or change as you tackled this writing project over the past couple of years?
Well, I'd say the biggest shift was really understanding the unbelievable, I wouldn't say it was a shift as much as a deepening of my understanding of the power that people have to transform systems. So many of us think about systems change as formal structures. We've got to change the laws, we've got to change the policies. No question, that's true. But who the heck's going to change them, okay? People. And if people can't get their acts together, they're not going to change them, right? So I began to see basically the power of the powerless, as Vaclav Havel called it in a book of the same name. And he inspired the Solidarity movement in Poland, and the power of the powerless ended up bringing down the Soviet regime. So I think I began to not only appreciate, but understand what is it about the power of people? Why is it so critical? Why is it that we ignore it? We don't look at it. We don't see it. How can we harness it? So that all of that is what I began to learn while I was writing the book.
Yeah, power of the powerless.
Yeah, it is.
I wanted to back up for one second. You got a chance to work with Chris Argyris,
yes,
who's no longer with us, but his work lives on. All of us who work in this field use, whether it's ladder of inference or double loop learning or any of the sort of concepts. What was it like to work with Chris?
Well, it was an extraordinary privilege, first of all. He has to be one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. And I've met a lot of brilliant people, including Roger Fisher, who you well know. And one of the things that people don't fully appreciate is that it was the Chris Argyris and Donald Shern show. In other words, Chris's closest colleague and friend was Don Shern, who was over at MIT. The two of them together wrote two seminal books. One was called Theory of Practice, and the other one was Organizational Learning. And it was their partnership that was so extraordinary. And I would say Don was the other most brilliant person I've ever met in my life. So, there's that. But there's also, they had the capacity to really see the person they were talking with and really be present in a way that was extraordinary. And Chris, in particular, had an extraordinary capacity for empathy. At the same time, he did not suffer fools gladly. He was very tough and very confrontational. And when he got triggered, which he did, he was a human being, he was extremely formidable. And I think one of the reasons why we got along so well for as long as we did is I had three older brothers who were exactly the same way and a father cut from the same cloth. So it was like, ho-hum, what else are you going to throw my way? So it didn't bother me as much as it bothered many other people. So I've just learned an enormous amount from him about, I'd say the most important thing I learned from him is that you really can't understand a system deeply until you try to change it. Because until you try to change it, you won't see the defenses that are holding a system in place. You have to surface the defenses of a system in order to change the defenses. And you won't get at them until you try to fundamentally change them. You said double loop learning. Until you try to go to the fundamental norms, beliefs, and so on. And that has stayed with me all my life, both as a researcher and as a social scientist trying to understand the world.
I find that powerful given my own experience trying to do organizational change. It's amazing the things that come out of the woodwork.
Yes, yep.
Nowhere is that going to be more complex than as we get into talking about, affecting American society and political culture and so forth as we get into the book. And as we do so, you mentioned earlier kind of these patterns that you were seeing both in organizational systems, but then happening nationally. Could you share a little bit about the context in which you wrote this book and how you just kind of the basis and recent crises, the fact that this is an election year, we're a nation in a very precarious position, many different perceptions amongst Americans. How do you view the current situation?
Sure thing. Well, I first started writing the book during the pandemic. My husband and I live between Vermont and Massachusetts, as you mentioned, and we were in Vermont. We spent a lot of time in Vermont, yet we were very connected to what was happening in the country. And so, I was watching the Trump presidency become more and more polarizing, camps starting to form for and against him in a way that was very vitriolic, very emotionally driven, and becoming increasingly intractable. That was one. The second is the pandemic, and the pandemic really caught my attention because it was awful and it killed lots of people. But aside from that, to me, it was the archetype of the kinds of problems we face as a species today, which is it's problems that cross boundaries. You can't confine them. They require us to work across nations, and they require us to work across groups. And this is something I learned while writing the book, but this is what first caught my attention, is that that's going to require us to take another evolutionary step, and we can come back to that. And then the third thing was the very public murder of George Floyd and other African-American men and women, and the subsequent racial reckoning. It was as if people went to sleep for about 30 years. Everybody's like, oh, wow, that's right. We got a problem with race in this country. Whoa, geez, And it's like, and people are talking about being woke. And I was like, when did we go to sleep? Yeah. Because we went to sleep. Because that was not news to anybody who was around in the 60s. This was not news. So it was, how is it that this is like an awakening or a reckoning? So I was looking at that and I was going, wow, this is not right. And so I began to think about it. And I said, there's something going on here. There's a story behind the story. Yes, there's polarization, but what's really at the root of that? And I began to hypothesize, ever since our founding, and actually long before, we have lived separate lives as a nation. We've lived separate lives in groups that are divided across demographic and ideological lines. Now, almost every podcast I've been on has focused on our ideological differences and acted as if somehow the demographic differences don't matter or they're not as important or as salient. First of all, those two are tightly coupled. And secondly, the demographic divides have been around since our founding and before, and they feed ideological differences and polarization. So it really is, we have been divided along both demographic and ideological lines, and at different points throughout our history, when different threats have emerged that have made people anxious, we have tended to get more and more closed and insular within like-minded groups of the same ilk, and we've tended to get more distant and fearful of groups that are different from us. So that then leads us to become more insular as we get more fearful and more closed within. And the more insular and closed within, the more distant, hateful, and fearful we get across. The more distant and hateful we get across, the more insular within. And it becomes this escalating cycle. And you can see it escalate over the last 50 years. And it's just gotten worse and worse and worse. Now, the thing about this that's so important is twofold. And this is something I think people don't really appreciate. People say what I just said, and it's like, oh, yeah, that's bad. We got to do something about it. But the question is, why do we have to do something about it? Why is it bad? Why should we care, okay? And there are two reasons why I think we should care. One is we have a bunch of problems that we have to solve, from immigration to climate change to global economies to authoritarianism rising in the world to wars to pandemics, okay? All of these cross boundaries, okay? All of these require us to come together and come up with a solution we can agree on. And as long as we are living these separate lives in these groups that are more and more insular, we are not going to be able to solve problems that are going to affect our fate as a species, okay? So that's one. And then the other one is authoritarianism is rising around the world, not at a chance. It's rising because of this dynamic. The more insular people get within and distant across, the more they look up the hierarchy for their conflicts to get solved. The more they look to a strong leader. The more they want someone to solve the problems for them because they've given up on their ability to solve it themselves. So they want an authoritarian leader. So what do authoritarian leaders do? People who want to be authoritarian. They play on that. They immediately put a wedge between groups so that they can consolidate their power. And this is part of an authoritarian playbook. Anne Applebaum talks about it. Rachel Kleinfeld talks about it. These are known tactics used by authoritarians. So we are being played for chumps by folks who want to keep us divided so they can consolidate their power both politically and economically. It's the Elon Musks, the Peter Thiels of the world, the Putins, the list goes on in the political and economic front of people who are advantaged by keeping the space between us closed within and distant across. It's not just distant across, it's closed within.
You mentioned fear as something that causes us to be insular there. How do we tackle fear as a society?
I think Freud talked about that. In a lot of books, it's a very primal emotion, obviously. Fear, anxiety, and part of it is, let's talk about what fear really is. I mean, fear is our amygdala responding to a threat. And part of what I think will help us, and this is true of an individual, it's true of groups, it's true of nations, is to really try and step back and say, okay, I'm afraid. I mean, name it. Say, I'm afraid. This is scaring the bejesus, and I do this frequently. This is scaring the bejesus out of me. And then saying, okay, so what is it that I'm afraid of? And one of the things that I think causes enormous anxiety is just uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. We want to survive, so we imagine the worst thing that's going to happen so that we can be prepared for it. And so we start to focus on the worst thing that could happen. And that's like a really bad thing to do, because you're not focusing on the things that could avoid it, first of all. You're not focusing on solutions, and you're getting yourself more and more scared, which is constraining your thinking more and more. So this is an understandable but maladaptive response to understandably uncertain and anxiety-producing circumstances.
It's interesting, what struck me there, we read so much today about the rising level of anxiety in our nation, all the way down to, at the child, down at children suffering from it. A lot of blame is put on devices and on social media, and not trying to excuse those two things as potentially being factors. What I haven't heard a lot about, which kind of what you just said, which was this fear, which may be triggered by both ideological and demographic differences, divides, is potentially leading to this uncertainty, and that's what's causing the anxiety. I don't hear anybody talking about that.
Well, there are people who do talk about uncertainty as a contributing factor. I don't know if people fully appreciate how troubling that is for human beings. And it's, by the way, reporters are human beings. They don't like uncertainty any more than you and I do, and they know their readers don't like uncertainty. So what do? They start making predictions. And in today's world, that's almost the most ridiculous thing you could possibly do, because who the hell knows what's going to happen? As I said in a recent post on Substack, we're over the edge of the wild. I mean, anybody who tries to predict, it's like, good luck with that. Okay? I mean, I think what we have to understand is that we are in for a rough ride, and we'd better get ourselves ready. It's like, I would be getting ourselves ready like you get ready for a marathon or for a bike race, We got to get our emotional muscles, our mental muscles, and our physical health prepared for what's going to be a rough ride. We cannot predict what's going to happen. The only thing we can control is how do we respond to it, not just as an individual, but in our communities. How do we and our family respond in our communities? And how do we make sure that we are protecting our nation against threats to our body politic?
Now, you wrote this beautiful challenge that I think echoes what you were just saying. How do we get ready for what lies ahead? Here's what you wrote in your book. We forget that our power as citizens lies not just in our rights as individuals, but in our responsibilities as people for working together to build a better future. And I love that for so many reasons. I was a history major, so I love the historical anecdotes you use in the book. But this also reminded me of, past when I've read Aristotle, when he wrote about citizenship, and obviously inspired by Plato and Socrates.
Right, yep.
Ben Franklin's quote, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom." Okay, so why do you believe that mindset is so important for Americans as we sit here in 2024 with a population of over 333 million people?
We were a country that was founded on rights. And the reason we were founded on rights is because we didn't have them relative to Britain, okay? So we wanted our independence, and we wanted the right to vote, we wanted the right to property, we wanted rights. And that was the big gestalt in terms of political theory at the time. It was the rights of man, okay? And so we come from a heritage of right. And what it has inadvertently given rise to is a competition over who has the right to do what. Lack of understanding that one person's rights can infringe on another person's rights. It's almost as if we become spoiled brats looking to our parents to get our way. It's my night to watch TV, it's not, it's just gotten out of control. And so I was trying to understand, what is this about? And I thought, we've never tempered this pursuit of rights by cultivating a sense of responsibility for the whole of the enterprise, which, by the way, we each have an individual interest in. It's not like many in the past are called sort of a mommy concern, the whole. No, No. If it goes on all of us. We're all screwed. Okay. So we all have an interest, a vested interest in the survival of the nation. And that means we've got to take responsibility for that. That has not been cultivated. And, I don't know if I'd call it a mindset or an orientation, but that is where I think our future lies. And because if you do not see responsibility, you also don't see your power. And so when you just focus on give me my rights, as opposed to I am going to now act as if I have that right, I'm going to take responsibility for ensuring the survival of my community, my nation, my family. If you don't do that, then things are going to go down. So the paradox is that once citizens have taken responsibility for the welfare of their nation and for their future, they have had the power to lead their nations out of darkness. And in the preface, I gave multiple examples. One example would be 300,000 soldiers stranded on the shores of Dunkirk at the beginning of World War II. If they had not been saved, it would have probably been the end of World War II. And it was a small fleet of boats with British citizens who went over to save them. It was nonviolent mass resistance in India that freed India from British rule. It was the abolitionist movement that ended up slavery. It goes on and on and on. The civil rights movement, the suffrage movement, the labor movement in Poland, the military dictatorship being brought down in Argentina, the end of legal apartheid in South Africa. It just goes on. And we never think of this. We think about how powerless we are. We don't think about these moments in history when we've been able to turn things around. And by the way, I think we're in the middle of turning it around again now, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book. I wanted people to know that there are hundreds of thousands of people across our country organizing to work across divides on common problems to end the polarization that is pulling our nation apart. That movement is powerful. Even if it's under the radar because of our media, you can find out about it. It's not hidden. We'll talk more about it in our conversation today.
Yeah, it's good. One thing I wanted to ask you about was your book mentions forces that turn differences into divides, be they demographic, ideological, or other. Could you explain these differences and why they lead to greater polarization?
Well, it's forces that turn the differences into divides. Differences don't have to become divides, right? So the question is, what is it that turned our differences into divides? And it's particularly important we answer that question now because although we're one of the oldest democracies, as a multi-group democracy, we're really quite young. It's only been since the civil rights laws of 1965 that we became a truly multi-group democracy where everybody had a seat at the table. And so figuring out how to harness our differences for the common good, how to harness our differences for creative answers to difficult problems that we've been unable to solve, that's the question. So one of the ways we're going to have to answer that is by trying to understand what we're up against, okay? And why is it that these differences get turned into divides? And I talk about 5 forces. And one is we all share a history in which groups were sorted and ranked according to their innate characteristics. And that began with slavery. When slavery had to be justified, the way it got justified was to say that there's a racial hierarchy, and on that hierarchy, some groups are not even human and they're chattel, okay? But that stayed with us. That notion of a hierarchy that you could rank and sort groups on stayed with us. And you can see it throughout our history. Immigrants that came from Eastern Europe or came from Southern Europe were considered as worthy as people who came from Northern Europe. This ranking of groups has been with us forever. And as James Baldwin said, history is not just about the past. History lives on in us. It's in the present. So we all share that history. It should be something we're not ashamed of. It should be something we understand. And we say, okay, so what are we going to do to alter the course of the future? The past is the past. There's nothing we can do about it. What do we do to alter the course of the future? So that's history. The second is we've all inherited from this history a set of cultural beliefs. And those cultural beliefs lead us to think of groups more or less consciously, not always consciously, in lesser, better, zero-sum terms. So those are cultural beliefs that are highly shared. We're not even aware of them, okay? The third is that history and culture together has produced segmented hierarchical institutions. So all the institutions we've ever been raised in are highly hierarchical, and many of them are quite segmented. A lot of organizational change efforts are trying to break out of silos. Well, where did we even learn to create silos? Who said we had to create silos? Okay. I mean, this is part of our heritage that we're just completely unaware of. So we've grown up in these segmented hierarchical institutions, and those shape the way we think and behave inside of groups and across groups. Marketing and sales,
Right.
or manufacturing and marketing, or, the people in the hierarchy up top and those below. So all of that comes into play. And then the fourth is that we have unconscious cognitive biases and implicit biases that make it hard for us to see when we're making matters worse for ourselves or others. So implicit biases around race, around gender, around age, around weight, disability. Mazrin Banaji, if you go to her implicit attitude test, IAT, on the internet, you can take your own test to score your own implicit biases. It's an awakening, okay? That's one kind of bias we have, but the other biases we have are just cognitive biases. We tend to look for confirming data to our views rather than disconfirming data. We can see what others are doing to upset us, but we don't see what we're doing to upset others. We're not aware of those, and as long as we're not aware of them, they can control us. We can't control them. So that's the fourth. And then the fifth is we all have psychological defenses designed to protect our identities, our status, and our self-esteem by ignoring or minimizing our role in making matters worse. And the problem there is the more you minimize your role for making matters worse, the less power you have. Okay? Because you're saying, hey, what can I do? Wasn't me. And if it wasn't you, you're kind of screwed because there's nothing you can do.
Right.
Okay? And I think one of the great things about me as a kid is I was delusional enough to convince myself there was something I could do. Okay? But it worked. All right? It worked really well. So, and there's obviously limits to what we can do. No question. And if I'm going to err, it'll be on the side of overestimating what I can do. But I'd much rather that than give up the ghost before I've even given it a try. So those are the five forces.
I love how you frame the five forces. We could spend the next month talking about each one, right? And you go into great depth in the book. So many kids really do believe. They look at something and say, I can fix that. Yeah. And I'll tell you, how everything you said, understand our history, not be ashamed of it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But recognize that that's part of the history and we got to do something about it. This idea that we actually have trained ourselves to create silos. Yeah. And those might be social silos, but they organizational as well. I'll tell you what you mentioned about biases. I am always more afraid of my implicit bias than am I explicit. My explicit, people can call me to the carpet on, I can build some awareness. It's really hard with the implicit piece.
This is the point of the reason why I talk about relationships is so fundamental is because you have to rely on others to help you see what you don't see because you'll never see them because they're implicit. Yeah. So, but if you say to people, look, if I do or say something that you think I'm just looking for confirming data or I'm not seeing my role, or I look like I'm biased against a group or a person, would you please point it out?
Yeah.
Okay. But point it out. Don't call it out. People are making each other ashamed of these things. And there lies nothing but sorrow because no one is allowed to learn. And we all have them, including the people who are calling people out.
All right. We could go a lot deeper here. I don't need to because I want to start transitioning into, all right, so things we can do. But is there anything else that you'd like to share from way of sort of foundational understanding that might be critical to listeners just to understand before we start getting into kind of things we do to remake the space?
The only other thing I'll say, I know you want to move on, so I'm going to say it briefly. We can dig into it more later, is I've become increasingly obsessed with the role that 24/7 news media on cable, on print, whatever, all kinds of media, news media, the role that they play and the role citizens play with them to keep us stuck in this polarized reality. Okay. So it's not caused by them, the citizens and the press, but citizens and the press have a relationship with each other that is keeping us stuck. And so we might want to come back to that at some point, or I could say something now about it. You tell me when you want to do it.
Why don't you go ahead and say something now towards it? We do want to bring up that relationship between citizens and the press.
Okay. So the big thing is I was on this jihad, against the way the press covers the news. And a lot of people who are much more comprehensive than I will be talk about what they call the outrage theory of change that much of the press subscribes to. Jay Rosen, I think, is one of the ones who've mentioned this. And the idea is if they point out a problem and all the people who are to blame for causing the problem, then it will lead to change. But it often doesn't, because they say nothing about what people are doing to solve the problem. They don't get to some of the things people might be creating or working on. And so it just builds outrage in the public square. And Roger Ailes once said to Judy Woodruff, and I thought it captured it perfectly, he said, you get two candidates running for office, and they're both on a stage. One gives the 3-point peace plan for the Middle East, and the other one falls in the orchestra pit. Who do you think the press is going to cover? Okay, and it's the orchestra pit. They have to make money. And so they are riveted on the extreme. They're riveted. The extremists jump in the orchestra pit almost every hour, okay, as a way to get press coverage. And so I was like, God, the press has got to stop doing this. And there's a group called Solutions Journalism Network that is actually doing that. They're reinventing the news. They're amazing. They're focusing not just on problems, but they're also focusing on solutions. So that was where a lot of my attention went. And then I began to see the reason why these guys are so successful. By the way, there is an emerging model of journalism, which I call the engage model, okay, which not only focuses on problems, but focuses on solutions, focuses on what people are doing to come together. That's the engage model. Solutions Journalism Network reports a lot about it. Christian Science Monitor has a great press. I mean, there are a lot of people who are starting to do that. Okay, so you have the outrage and you have the engage. The outrage is clearly the dominant model. And, that's very annoying because it's hurting us. But then I began to realize that citizens have an outrage mindset where they're focused only on the problems. They're consumed by threat. They are getting so fearful that they want to go to the outrage news outlet because they know they can find the threats they're afraid of and they can protect themselves. They think that's the answer. So they click, they pay money, they subscribe, they write outrageous comments, okay? And they outdo the outrage model, okay? So there's this sort of hand in glove between the outrage model of the news and the outrage mindset of the citizen. And they're feeding each other, okay? And so I think we need to shift to an engage mindset where we start to think about what can we do to solve problems in our communities, to work with others, to make progress, to start thinking about the upside that we have to work towards, not just the threats we have to guard against.
You're absolutely right.
So follow up there. It's like, how do we do that? Like, how do we come up with the solutions? Is it through asking good questions? Is it through understanding both sides? Like, how do we get better at that?
Well, I mean, negotiation is so brilliant at this, principled negotiation. And that's a lot of what I'm seeing happen organically in communities across our country. People are saying, we have a common problem here. Let me take an example which speaks to polarization. In Billings, Montana, back in the 1990s, there were a series of 3 hate crimes. And the first one was a Native American home that someone vandalized and put a SWAT stick on it and said, die. And then a little while later, an African American church was intimidated by skinheads. And then a little while later, a young 6-year-old boy put a menorah in his window at Hanukkah and somebody threw a brick through it. The community responded, in essence, by saying, not in our town. The painters union went and painted the house for free. White neighbors started accompanying the African-American congregants to their church, and the local paper published a menorah in the paper, and hundreds of people put a menorah in their window. And so a woman by the name, this is an example, okay, of what? A woman by the name of Patrice O'Neill, just like you and me. She's a filmmaker. She goes, well, that's really interesting. I'm going to go film what they did. So she went and she filmed what they did. It ended up becoming a PBS special called Not in Our Town. And Not in Our Town ended up becoming a national movement. And they have chapters across the country. But back then, in the 1990s, she and Ryan Miller, her partner, decided after doing the film that they would go back to Oakland, California, where they're from, and start showing the film in the Bay Area. And so they showed it to the communities there, and people from all walks of life came to these things. Law enforcement, educators, faith leaders, regular citizens, everybody came to these things. And at the end, she said, so, okay, guys, well, what do you think about these folks in Billings, Montana? And they said, I don't want to talk about Billings, Montana. I want to talk about our community, okay? Are we creating a community that is strong enough to repel hate? Are we creating a community where people feel like they belong? Are we creating a community where we're going to be proud and safe to raise our kids? And that was the origins of it. That's just what one person did. But they started getting creative about what are the fundamental interests that people have in common? Everybody wants to be safe. Nobody wants their kids not to be safe, okay? People don't like hate. Even when they're hateful, they don't like hate. They want to reduce hate. I'm not going to go into the detail I just went into, but in Maine, the problem was in Lewiston, Maine, it was a deteriorating economic situation because the mills had gone south. Everybody wanted a better economic situation, okay? In order to get it, they had to start to embrace Somali refugees who were migrating to the town. It ended up the Somali refugees turned around the entire economic situation, but not without a fight from some white nationalist kind of folk in the state. And so people got together and created Maine People's Alliance, where everybody came together to push back on these forces of hate and instead got people working together and getting creative about solutions, including ranked choice voting, so that people like LePage, who became governor, couldn't get elected again. So these are the kinds of things people are doing and can do in order to create a different future than we have now.
Those are great examples. Are there other simple and practical yet effective ways that we can be increasing cross-group interactions, even building friendships with, what we call those peoples, the people that we're often quick to despise and vilify? What else should we be doing?
Well, the first thing I would say is don't make a case. Don't build a case for your point of view. Build a relationship. So take a page out of the book of Matthew Stevenson, who built, as an Orthodox Jew, built a close relationship with the heir apparent of the white nationalist movement, okay? You couldn't find more different people. He said, I'm never going to persuade this guy. He's been brainwashed his whole life. I'm going to build a relationship with him so he can see what a Jew really is like, okay? And then through that relationship, both minds began to change and they began to transform. So the first thing is to try to build a relationship, not immediately get into the places where you're different. The second is to look for common ground. And the common ground, and by the way, sometimes there isn't common ground. You got to create common ground. Okay, so yeah. I'm not a common ground kind of girl, but you got to create common ground. But that said, it's not like there's no common ground. We share a lot of the same values. We care about a lot of the same things. We want the same things for our kids, okay? We may differ over how to get there. The person who has worked for me for 26 years voted for Trump. I did not vote for Trump. I will do everything in my power to make sure he never reaches office again. And we are very close, and we have a lot in common, but it isn't Trump. But there's lots that we do have in common, okay? And I learn a lot from her about how she sees the world. So, and then the last thing I'd say is don't try to do this alone. There are a gazillion organizations out there. Go on the internet. Go to Starts With Us. That's just one, Starts With Us. Go to weaver.org. Go to Not in Our Town. Go to Braver Angels. There's a whole host of organizations that you can go to that, let me just give you the names of some. Urban Rural Action. Okay.
We know Joe Bubman's organization.
Oh, yeah, of course you do. And you know Joe. Country First, which Adam Kinzinger started. Take One Small Step. Citizen Connect has a whole host of organizations. Listen First Project. Don't try to do this on your own, okay? This is hard stuff. We've been so brainwashed over the past 10, 15 years. Don't try to do this alone. Get help. Work with other people.
I love that because just the advice, right? The building relationship, the creating common ground. I'm with you. I don't think common ground always naturally exists. Yeah. It requires some work sometimes. Enough of an optimist to probably get this through my Roger Fisher roots, which is, I believe we work hard enough, we can find it.
Yes, we can. Or create it.
Or create it.
Yeah,
that's right.
Exactly.
That's that better word. That's a much better word.
Yeah, no, it's both. I mean, we'll find some and we'll create some, but it's not like it's never going to be found or created. Yeah.
Digging in further, as we think about the things citizens can do to remake the space between us, is it fair to categorize these actions as things individuals can do, things groups or communities can do, mindset or behavioral thing, structural or systematic things, and so on? Or would you apply a different categorization or thinking about next steps?
The reason why I wrote the book is because if you look around at what people were focusing on as a way of solving polarization and advancing the progress of our nation, almost everything was looking at things like, what can we do? And by the way, I think these are all worthy things to do. How do we regulate social media? How do we pass laws around AI? All of which we have to do. How do we reform our primary system? Should we be a multi-party democracy? All of these things are absolutely critical. And all of them are out of our direct control. So I wanted to define a problem that only we can solve. No one else can solve it. And that's the space between us. We are in control of how insular and closed-minded our groups are. Nobody else, just us.
Right.
It's true the news affects it. There's no question. Algorithms affect it. No question. But we are in control of whether we go along with that or whether we pursue things outside of our little tiny world that we live in. Okay. And nobody is going to tell us or make us create bridges across groups. That's entirely up to us. So this is entirely within our control. And the funny thing is that until we do that, none of these other reforms can happen. They won't happen. Okay. So this is ground zero from my point of view. If we don't do this, it's game over. So it's on us. We got to do it. It's the most important systemic change we can make because it is systemic. It's the informal system.
So the challenge is out there for all of us.
Yes, it is.
Great.
Now, one of those systemic problems is a source of frustration, I think, for many Americans, who would consider our current political system broken. Are there structural changes that are feasible, not only for elected leaders, right, but for all of us to kind of stop what you've described in the book as us being potted plants?
All the stuff I've talked about so far stops us from being potted plants. But I think the question of political reform, people like Jane Mansbridge and Lee Drutman have far more to say about that of intelligence than I would. But they will talk about implementing things like ranked choice voting, so primaries are less polarized, having multi-party systems. They have all sorts of technical solutions to what is primarily the systemic consequence of an adversarial democracy. And we were founded as an adversarial democracy. We don't conceive of ourselves as friends. We conceive of ourselves as adversaries. So where I'm more inclined to cut in is reframing the underlying image of democracy, where we see one another as friends and cultivate an abiding interest in the interest of our friend, which is what you do in a friendship. You care about their interests. You don't just run over them, and you're not going to have the friendship very long. And if we did that, we would convert rivalrous self-interest into more equitable self-interest, because we would care that no one group over time is disadvantaged, because we would see it as that's not the way you treat a friend. So that's more where my mind goes. On the formal stuff, I'd highly recommend Lee Drutman, whose work I think is terrific, and Jane Mansbridge.
That's a great answer on kind of a strategic level. Let's go a little more tactical now. When this program airs, Diana, we will have elected our next president, along with a number of other representative positions. Without a doubt, half the people listening to the program are going to be maybe angry, maybe lost or anxious, might be other ways. And half are going to be, maybe gloating and happy. So how would you advise our listeners, regardless of their response to the election results, to create belonging and demonstrate empathy with others so we might start moving forward and, again, kind of putting ourselves in November of 2024?
Well, so, it's the podcasts I've been on have migrated from asking me, so how optimistic are you about the future, to, oh my God, the election's coming up, we're kind of screwed. And what I would have answered a couple of months ago is I said, in the long term, I'm optimistic. In the short term, I think we're in for some pain. And I think we are in for some pain around the election. I can't imagine there not being, and that's the nature of democracy in some ways. The way it's set up now is someone loses, right? And so there's going to be disappointment. And given the stakes and given the polarization and the intensity and the vilification, it's going to be very intense. So it's all bets are off as to what happens. Now, let's say Harris and Waltz win. We saw what happened in 2020. So that's very worrisome. Could be a lot of challenges that we were talking about uncertainty before. It could drag out the uncertainty for months, which is breeding ground for violence and disruption. And so I worry about that. And if Trump wins, and he who shall not be named, then, there could be mass demonstrations. And we've seen what happens when there are mass demonstrations. I mean, somebody on the right could drive a car through the crowd. Okay, again, so I'm very concerned about violence. So the one thing I think all of us can do is I think we've all got to invest in strengthening the immune system of the citizens' immune system, which are strengthening these organizations that are really working across divides to try to bring people together to work on common problems at the local level. These organizations are anchor. these organizations are where we can find people who are going to try to calm the waters, not escalate it, understand the desperation and anxieties that people have. And I think the more people listening can connect themselves to these organizations, the more they will have vehicles through which they can play a constructive role at a time that will be very difficult. But it will be very difficult. And marginalized groups, I think, are going to feel the pain the most, as often is the case. Yeah. And it's very worrisome to me. And so I think we need to be watching out for one another a lot.
Well, I think the tendency towards becoming paralyzed is strong, to do nothing or to react with violence. I mean, in fact, it goes back to some of the concepts from Difficult Conversations, which is my tendency is to do nothing, which means to try to bury it. That doesn't work well for toxic waste, nor does it work well for these problems. But my fear is that I'm going to throw fuel on the fire.
Yeah.
And I think knowing how to navigate something different is fairly key.
Yeah, that idea originated with our friend Chris Argyris. He talks about the left-hand column, which is he used to ask us to take a piece of paper and put a line down the middle, and on the right, write down a dialogue we had that was difficult, and on the left-hand side to write down what we were thinking and feeling and not saying. And, as you point out, a lot of people stifle what they're thinking and feeling and not saying for fear that they're going to explode. And the problem isn't that they are censoring. The problem is that we think in such a way that if we raise it, we're screwed. And if we don't raise it, we're screwed. The problem is how we think, which is, I'm right, you're wrong. My job is to get you to see it. You should be punished because you're not only wrong, but you're wrong for being wrong. And as long as we think that way, we're going to be in trouble. So I think we should hold on to our right to make a mistake as long as we learn from it, and give other people the right to make mistakes as long as they learn from it, and truly try to help each other do better, because we're not going to get there by ourselves. We're going to have to figure out a way to get there together.
Agreed. All right. So when this airs, Thanksgiving will only be a couple of weeks after the election. Do you have advice on how to do that at the Thanksgiving table and have meaningful conversation with those we love and care about, friends and family?
If I were sitting at that table, you know what I'd do? I'd say,
eat turkey.
Yeah. And I'll probably eat turkey after saying this. I think the first thing I would do is I would try to hold the space and hold the people. I would probably say, not talking about politics, just how's everybody feeling right now? How can people at this table help? And what are your hopes for the future? And what are your worries? And how can, those at this table, try to be helpful to you? I mean, I think that's really the stance we have to take.
Your book covers both historical and current examples of success stories, and you've shared several already here today. Is there one in particular that you feel most strongly demonstrates how we, as society, might come together and re-engage in meaningful dialogue for a better future?
God, it's like asking me to choose among my children. The one I found most stunning, because it's the most extreme, is befriending your ideological enemy. And I mentioned it earlier about an Orthodox Jew, Matthew Stevenson, and his friend Moshe Ash, who reached out and decided not to alienate or ostracize Derek Black when it was uncovered that he was not only a white nationalist, but he was the godson of David Duke and the son of Don Black, who launched Stormfront, the first hate site. Okay. And Eli Saslow wrote the book Rising Out of Hatred. And I use that as most of the data for the essay. And I strongly recommend people read it. The person I pay the most attention to is Alison Gornick. What she does towards the latter part of the book is probably the last quarter of the book, when Derek is really starting to think through his beliefs and reconsider them, largely with her. I mean, the two of them said, let's put our beliefs to test. Let's do research together and submit our beliefs to scrutiny, okay? I mean, incredible thing. But at the end, she was quite challenging of him as well as quite loving towards him. When he reflected back on what allowed him to transform, somebody had said something like, well, he was a smart kid and he read a lot about how his beliefs were wrong. And he goes, nah. He said it was friends regardless who helped me see the impact of what I was doing. Friends regardless who helped me see the impact of what I was doing. I mean, that is so unbelievable. And, that is something we should extend to others. But it's also, maybe we should ask our friends, what's our impact?
Yeah.
Okay. So we can see it, because I can guarantee you people aren't telling you. When your slip's showing, they're not telling you.
Yeah.
You got to ask. And he asked, she answered, and it went both ways. And it was a beautiful friendship. And they're now married. I mean, it's an extraordinary story.
What's interesting is you talk about kind of extending that to impact, asking others, what is my impact? How do you see? I always think of the concept of intent versus impact. I don't know if I've ever framed it in that way, which is to ask someone, invite them to say, hey, tell me about the impact I'm having.
So important. And, by the way, my husband would always say when I would point out something he was doing that had a negative impact, because he and I differ on this construct. So he'll say, well, that wasn't my impact. And I would say, well, I understand that. It comes quite naturally. And by that, I wasn't trying to be snarky. That's how he was brought up. That's how he was trained. That's what he learned to do. Okay. And right. I said, if I thought it was your intent, I wouldn't be married to you. It's just how you're programmed. Right. Right. At the same time, I would say that doesn't get you off the hook, that it wasn't your intent. Doesn't get you off the hook from looking at what you did to contribute to that impact. Right. And it doesn't get me off the hook from asking the question, why does that trigger me so much? Because that's not good for me. And so then we can both help each other deal with the situation rather than cast blame.
Yeah. Wonderful framing. Diana, at least twice in the book, you refer to this concept that coming closer together again will require passion, not numbers. So as we prepare to conclude here on what's been just a great conversation, hopefully encouraging to others, could you share with us what you mean by that idea and maybe why we can take some positive perspective and have confidence in a better tomorrow?
Well, this is one of the things that I must have said throughout the book. James Baldwin said, it's a great quote. I want to quote it for you. This was during the 1960s. He goes, well, I'm tired. I don't know how it will come out. I know that no matter how it comes out, it will be bloody. It'll be hard. I still believe that we can do with this country something that has not been done before. What an extraordinary statement that is. We are misled here because we think of numbers. You don't need numbers. You need passion. And this is proven by the history of the world. And that's what I try to drive home, preface, when I write about all the different nations that citizens have led them out of disaster. This is one of many stories I tell about our history, where the few who were passionate changed the course of history. But I also want to ask your readers or your listeners to entertain a question before I go on with the answer, which is, so George Washington, okay, it's Christmas night in December, 1776. The war is going badly. The Continental Army is losing battle after battle. It's so bad that the morale in the colonies has tanked and everybody's losing confidence that we're never going to win the War of Independence and people are no longer supporting it. It was so bad that Thomas Paine wrote American Crisis in December of that year, and Washington distributed it to all 5,000 of his troops to read. And it begins with that famous line, these are times that try men's souls. And he goes on, the summer soldier, who abandons the nation will long be forgotten, but he who stands by it now. It's a great opening. Anyway, so here's Washington. It's freezing cold. It's sleeting. It's just turned to snow. It's a bitter wind. He shows up at the edge of the Delaware River. He's got 5,000 troops. 3,000 of them are fit for duty. So 2,000 of them are spent. Okay. And on the other side of the river are the British, and they have 25,000 men and 30,000 if they need them. So the guy next to Washington says, oh, look, it's over. We've lost. It's done. Okay. And I want everybody just for a moment to imagine, just ask yourself the question, what would have happened had Washington, looking at the numbers or the polls, okay, today, made a prediction and based on that prediction said, oh, you're right. I'm done. I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to turn around. It's all over. Gone. Okay. What would have happened? We wouldn't be here today. But Washington refused to just play the odds. He wanted to change the odds. He wanted to figure out, how do we change the odds? All right, we got 3,000 men. They got 25,000, 30,000 if they need it. All right, what are we going to do? So he crosses Delaware and he attacks at Trenton, which is less well defended, and he wins. And then he goes on to Princeton. Same thing, wins. And what happened as a result of that is he built up the momentum that he needed to shift morale. And by shifting morale, he shifted support. And he had people's heads in the game again. All right? This is exactly what happened when Kamala Harris became the new nominee. All of a sudden, complete change. I mean, it is amazing Look at what happened. None of that was predicted. Okay. That was literally changing the odds. I think one of the things I always think about is how do we change the odds? Not what's going to happen, but how do we change the odds? And that throughout our history has been the story of success, and it has been the few. It has always been the few.
That was a beautiful story. And your focus on the few reminded me of two things. And I'll share both of these. And unfortunately, we probably won't wrap up because I got to give you a chance to respond. But one is this idea, at least in military doctrine, about the forlorn hope.
Yeah, that's
the
great.
idea of a vanguard that leads the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. It's not a large force. No. It's a force that can go accomplish what we need it to accomplish. Yeah. They're going to lead the rest of us forward.
That's exactly right.
And then the other thing is I'm listening to you, I was just thinking of Churchill's quote after the Battle of Britain, which was never in the field of human conflict. Right. Conflict is what we're talking about today. Right? Was so much owed by so many.
Yes. Yeah. To so few. That's exactly right. And we never should forget that because it's true. Yeah. More of us need to be the few.
That's right. That's right. Well, you've given us that challenge on this. So thank you so much for your insights, for writing the book, Remaking the Space Between Us, folks. Please pick it up. I think it'd be a great read for November 2024. Give us some perspective, as well as a call to action of how we can be contributors in this effort. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today.
Well, thank you, guys. What a fun conversation with the two of you. I really appreciate it.
It's good. Well, that is it for us on today's podcast. If you haven't already, please rate, review, and subscribe to the NEGOTIATEx podcast, and we'll see you in the next episode.